Hello and welcome back to the Maverick Life podcast. My guest today is the most present guest we've ever had on either the ROI podcast or the Maverick podcast. He is, of course, the bow-tied Mara. Today, we are going to be covering all facets of life. We're going to be talking about his background as a Maverick operating down there in South America. We're going to talk about updates, particularly in Argentina, with the first 2 or 3 months of Javier Milei's presidency. We're going to talk about what's happening with the price discovery. It's chaos down there. We're going to talk about Bitcoin. This man is one of the earliest adopters of Bitcoin and has made a ton, nailing the timing around Bitcoin. We're going to talk about the future, a real estate update, of course, being the real estate maverick that he is. And we're going to talk about a new expansion to the consulting services of the Mara, which is how to avoid toxic Latinas and how to stay alive in South America. And it is, without further ado, and great pleasure, I want to welcome Mara back to the podcast. How are you doing, sir? How are you surviving the chaos in Argentina?
Uh, yeah, so far so good. I mean, it's not that chaotic yet, but I do think we're in for some turbulent times anytime soon. I mean, there have been some riots and some protests, but I think the upcoming months are gonna give a lot of material in the not so positive sense, so to say. I'm still very bullish, but it is a fact that everything has become you know twice as expensive in dollar terms, and salaries have stalled. So if this drags on for a lot longer, I think people are really going to start to revolt and not take it anymore.
And this has always been our fear. We being the more libertarian, free market orientated people, we know what will eventually work. But between where Argentina has found itself after, let's call it a century, basically of Peronism, to where it needs to be, there is going to be an awful lot of pain in the unwinding of this. You've been down in Argentina for what, nearly 20 years. Talk me through what you perceive have been the biggest changes since way back then to now.
Um, so yeah, I think ever since I've been here, like at the start, it was, the economy was growing very fast after, because I visited in 2003, and then in 2005, I really started living here. And at that point, Argentina was basically recovering from the 2001 crisis. And it also had the commodity boom with it. So, soy was expanding rapidly in price, and there's a lot of tax dollars that flow into the central bank thanks to that sector. The agricultural sector is one of the most important for Argentina in terms of funds because they have export tariffs. So back then, it was really booming. I think Argentina was growing at 8% year over year. But of course, still very protectionist economy, et cetera. And the whole Nacional y Popular. So, everything that comes from Argentina is better. That was sort of instilled during that time, and really focused heavily upon. So, they really try to regain their national industry, et cetera, not be so dependent on imports. Um, and then I think right upon like 2011, that's when it all sort of came to a grinding halt. The whole expansion of the economy, and basically the economy hasn't grown since then.
And what was it about
Um,
2011 in particular? So we had the 2001 nightmare devaluation overnight. I think the peso dropped by a third, if memory serves. And there
yes.
were riots because that's painful. If you're a retiree and you
Hmm.
wake up and all of a sudden you have to go back to work, or your savings has basically been slashed by two-thirds. Then we had a recovery, 2011. What was going on then?
So in 2011, funds were sort of running dry because during all this time, Argentina didn't really have access to foreign creditors because of their default of the 2001 crisis. And they had restructured 93% of their debt with creditors. Only 7% did not accept that deal. And that is the part that Paul Singer with Elliott Management ended up buying, that distressed debt. And he took that to court and, a lot further until finally Macri decided to pay that when, I think it was in his first month of being president, he paid that back so that Argentina could have access to foreign credit again. Um, so during you could really see that from 2011 onwards, they started, trying here and there and trying to grab everything they could to get more capital. So they basically confiscated aerolíneas argentinas from Iberia. They nationalized YPF. And there was just like a whole range of nationalizations going on, et cetera, just because the funds were running dry and they didn't know where to get money from. They even had loans from Venezuela at I think it was close to 20% in dollar terms. It was just completely nuts. Because Maduro was a friend, or Chavez at that time was a friend, so they didn't mind kicking back some more dollars to friends.
Wow.
So it was, and then Macri came aboard, and of course he did that as one of his first goals, and Paul Singer happy, Macri happy because we had access to international capital, but at the same time, Macri didn't really change anything. So the problem was that he kicked out a bunch of Kirchnerists when he started, but then he expanded the state while he was in office, and Caputo was his Minister of Finance, the same Minister of Finance that under Milei now. And basically, he was, doing what the Macri's party wanted to do. So his hands were sort of tied. Like it was a completely different type of politics that they were doing. They sort of thought that, with a kind of Angela Merkel model, they would reform Argentina anyways, and that they would easily win, a second round of a second presidency. But it all ended up in shambles because I think it was after about 2 years, like the funds started lacking again. Everything was twice as expensive. And Macri didn't really change anything fundamentally in the core system of Argentina. So basically, he just went on the same route. What he did change right from the start almost was opening up the capital markets. So he did take off the limit to buying dollars, and that mainly benefited a lot of people in the financial sector who just started to offshore loads and loads of capital. So there was a big outflux of dollars at that time, and at a certain point in 2018, it became really critical in terms of reserves, etc. And basically, they were doing the same thing that Kirchnerism was doing, which was propping up the peso value by selling central bank reserves. So they kept selling reserves, dollar reserves, to prop up the peso value, and basically started draining the central bank. And the same thing that Kirchnerism was doing in the decade before. So it all came to a halt. I think it was May of 2018, and then they ran to the IMF, and since they could accept international credit, the IMF said, "Okay, we'll give you the biggest loan ever to any country," and
Which
that
is
money just
basically, for people who aren't as familiar with this story, this is basically giving a heroin addict an entire poppy farm.
Yes, exactly. And basically, that money went out of the window directly. I mean, there were, I think, 2 or 3 installments that were still due in other administrations. So I think Alberto Fernandez received 2 disbursements, and now Milei received the last disbursement from that 2018 loan, and now I think it's done. But it's pretty crazy, and of course, all those disbursements come with certain policy adjustments, etc., that the IMF wants Argentina to implement. But at the same time, during the previous government, they really didn't care and disbursed it anyways. It was just like, what the
Yeah,
fuck are you doing?
they
Yeah.
met none of the criteria. They revised it and
No.
said, okay, you've done nothing. Here's more money.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely, I'm definitely not a fan of IMF and those kind of international agencies, because I think they've done more harm than good in the long
Absolutely.
run. I don't think any country's ever gotten better after IMF loans, etc. It's just a way to keep countries sort of in the same debt trap forever. But at the same time, I can understand local politicians trying to get that extra credit, just because they of course, people like Massa, and I think also Macri just want to get on. Macri really wanted to win that second term, and that's why that money came really in handy to finance his campaign. And sort of the same thing with Massa with the China yuan swap. It was sort of like, okay, here we have some extra billies to try to do our utmost best to win this presidency.
Yeah, they
And
still
all that
lost.
money is just gone.
That's
Exactly.
incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible in horrible ways. So let me surmise from 2011 through to 2016, 17, whenever Macri's first term was, you had this nationalization, really a cash grab. They sold off all the assets, trying to service these foreign denominated debts. The problem with that is it kills your entrepreneurial culture as a nation. So is it fair to say now we've had at least one generation of Argentinians that doesn't really have that experience of value adding? So taking primary sources, going through the value chain, figuring out what a particular nation is good at so that they can sell that with higher margins and create a self-sustaining entrepreneurial culture. And
Hmm.
it's just so difficult to do that when you've nationalized everything.
Yeah.
From here on, we've seen Millet come in, and his non-negotiable has been no deficit end of 2024. And so far,
Yeah.
it seems like he's on track to do that. And what has that meant for price discovery in Argentina, where I'll be next month joining you? You've been on the ground. Talk me through what it's like living through this real time in this crazy environment of price discovery after a very long time without any real free market fluctuations.
Yeah, so it hits different for a lot of different sectors. So, for example, during the protectionist time, which is basically starting from Peronism to Malay, there's always like different sectors of the economy that are being protected. So during this century, it was mainly textile, the car industry, because there's a lot of local factories in Cordoba and in the province of Buenos Aires, assembly, etc. So all those, and especially textiles and electronics. So electronics is in Tierra del Fuego, so all the way down south. There's like this economic free zone. They don't pay VAT, and they have some other tax incentives. So some assembly factories started up there, and basically what they do is China ships in everything, and they just put it together, and they stamp a sticker of Tierra del Fuego on it, and then it's sort of like Industria Nacional. So it's kind of, it's not really any added value. It's just like assembling things, etc. And it's I think there's around 60,000 people working in that sector. But at the same time, those phones, etc., are cheap, but compared to international standards, they're still expensive, because they all those elements, they get shipped into Buenos Aires, then have to go all the way down south, which is a 4-hour flight. But all these things get moved by truck, which is days. Then they get assembled there in the free zone, yeah, by companies that don't pay tax, and then they move
Yeah.
all the way back to Buenos Aires, because that's where the bulk of the people live. So it's kind of like it adds on a lot of additional cost on each individual item. So those sectors are going to suffer a lot. The textile sector is going to suffer a lot, but at the same time, the impact is going to get felt, I think, not right away in those sectors, because at the same time, the import taxes and tariffs, etc., those are things that Milei can only change through the Senate. So right now, all these tariffs and ridiculous things to import stuff at 50% or more are still in place, because those can only be changed by law, and they have to go, I think, through both chambers, if I'm not mistaken, but at least a minimum through the Senate. So until they have like a bigger tax reform bill, all those tariffs will remain in place. So that means, like, sometimes I see people cheer on Twitter, oh yeah, great, so they're going to liberate imports and whatever. It just means that, for example, they were going to liberate food imports now. It just means that there's no more limit on certain food items, but at the same time they're going to be more expensive because the tariffs are still there. um, so that's one thing. Until those tariffs change, like, that stuff is just gonna still gonna maintain the same price level, and it's going to be expensive. Um, well, and for the end consumer, and especially the lower middle class to middle class, what I can see is that, it's been absolutely brutal in terms of price discovery, because basically what Millet did was, and I'm in favor, because I've seen what Macri did, and Macri was gradual. So Macri also wanted to take off subsidies of the electricity and gas companies, etc. So basically, they took off the band-aid very slowly, and it did become a bit more expensive, but at the same time was still, they were running crazy deficits and they needed more subsidies, these companies. And now basically, Millet is ripping the band-aid off right away, and I think within the next month, the gas bill is going to go up 700%. What you mean? I mean, if
Yeah.
you
Now,
live
to
in
be clear
Europe
for
or
listeners that aren't as familiar, this is because you've essentially had an artificial price environment from the protectionist policies that you
yes,
mentioned. And
exactly.
now, essentially, what's happening is you're really just coming back to where prices, quote unquote, should be as determined by the free
Hmm.
market. But because people haven't had experience with a truly free market for a long time, it is, yeah, the transition is extremely painful. If you, as you mentioned, your gas bill's going up by, call it 7x. Which other industries have been traditional beneficiaries of the protectionist policies and then that are now going to be going through this very painful rebirthing, so to speak?
So yeah, they were talking about the food industry as well, because apparently they were saying they were upping the price too much, etc. And so they were going to liberate food imports as well. Now, one of my worries there is that, with food, especially, food is one of those items that, unfortunately, I think you cannot really release in a free market, being Argentina or Africa, or any kind of developing nation, because all the developed nations have subsidies on agriculture. So if you go to Europe or you go to the US, they have insane subsidies on sugar plantations, etc. In Europe, like, it's, the whole agricultural, basically, if you can't sell all your milk, the state will buy it, etc., and they dump it in Africa. So that is something that local producers in developing countries cannot compete with. So if they do decide to open it all up, we're just going to end up with, a bunch of German yogurt that Aldi and Lidl don't sell, and they just dump it all here at, really low prices. So I think that could be an issue. I don't see that happening right now,
So you're
but
saying
it could.
that would really defeat any efforts to create some sort of self-sustainability in primary industries in Argentina because
Yeah,
you can
I
become.
think that's the only sector where it makes sense to have some kind of protection, just because of the dynamics in developed countries with the subsidies, because that's basically an unfair advantage that those farmers have
Indeed.
that does not exist in developing nations. And you see that in Africa, especially, where Europe just dumps everything on Africa, and the local farmers can't compete, and they all go to the cities. They stop working on their farms, etc., and then Europe feels bad, and they start dumping like a bunch of money in NGOs to try to help those poor people out. And basically, it's
Yeah,
just a
we know where that
perpetuating
goes.
cycle. Yeah, it just doesn't really help. So right now, of course, Argentina is a really huge food producer. So I think for now it's fine. But if this if they really if it would really go into overdrive, then that would be the worst case scenario, something like that happening.
What are your
Um,
thoughts? What are your thoughts about the government then trying to make up via doubling, say, the tariffs? I know in Australia, what we do is we just tax alcohol and cigarettes, like at least
mhm.
100%. Is it possible for the government to increase the import tariffs, or is it just going to create conflict with international trade relations, which Millet is now trying to finally build up by
Well,
country?
and that's a funny thing because they say they're going to open up imports, etc., and they're I'm sure they have every intention of doing so, but at the same time, Kirsten made sure that all these kind of competitive imports that could hurt the local economy, they all have like super high tariffs.
Okay.
So for now it's still protected until they change those tariffs. So that's why I don't think it will be that much of an impact unless Europe starts dumping it for zero. Then it might be, but then still, I don't think it will be that much of an issue. I think it's more like the end consumer and the middle class families that are really hit hard with increases. Because basically the upper class, it's small and they're always sort of like fine. The very low class, their subsidies were doubled because of all these. They know that basically this is going to make it very hard for most people, and especially for the lower class. So their subsidy plans and welfare plans have increased a little bit. Same for pensions, but for the lower middle class, the middle class, it's really hard because all healthcare providers, the energy bill, gas, water, everything is starting to double in dollars. So into pesos, that means it's like 4 or 5x, and the salaries in pesos stay the same. So even though the peso is strengthening against the dollar right now because of the monetary policies by Milei, everything is way more expensive. So the purchasing power is totally gone.
Yeah, your middle class margin is just getting squeezed.
Yeah, they're getting squeezed, and now they're coming up with a tax reform as well, where from I think $1,500 per month, you start paying income tax. So that used to not be the case. So it's also lowering that bracket. So it's getting tougher and tougher. So I think unless within the next 2 months or so, unless those salaries, get a bump, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for Millet to do anything with the willingness of the people.
Yeah, that is really the issue. So give me an indication, excuse me, across the board as to what the average price rise would be.
So like for example, I was paying, I think last year it was really ridiculous. I mean, I was checking what the same bill would be in the Netherlands, where I'm from. And of course, the Netherlands, I think, is one of the most expensive countries in Europe in terms of energy bills. So I was checking my energy bill, and it was like, I think around June or July last year, it was like $5 to $10 per month. And that same bill in Holland, in terms of kilowatt hour, would be 200 euros. So that already bumped up to almost 25 now, $25 a month. But with this new increase, it will probably go to 100 something. So and that really is like people are not going to be able to pay that because if
Yeah,
you
a 20x
yeah
increase when
because if you the salaries basically people that are lower middle class, they earn about $500 a month. Normal middle class are around like 1,200, maybe 2,000 for a family, maybe a little bit more. But those are really big impacts, especially because like the vast majority is around that $500 mark. So that's like, if you up the prices that much, they're not going to be able to, they're all barely scraping by to pay rent.
that's
Because rent is already like $300 minimum in Buenos Aires.
yeah. Which leads me to my next question. What's the social vibe right now? How much time do you perceive Millet has for this to take off and start to gain momentum before we start to see either he has to take a back step and slow down the pace of this transition, or we start to get some really nasty social unrest?
Well, I would say it's about 2 months away. Talking to my family members as well, like my mother-in-law, she just can't sleep at night because of the increases in her healthcare. She has private healthcare, and she was debating of doing that away because her pension doesn't cover it, or almost doesn't cover it. So we already said, no, we're going to pay for it. Don't worry, because you cannot go on public, healthcare. It's not that it's the end of the world, because there's really good doctors, really good public hospitals. The thing is, like, nothing is urgent. That's the problem. So it's like, as in most Western societies where you have public healthcare, like Germany or Holland, you're always the last one unless you're practically dying on the spot. So that's
Same
really
here.
different with private healthcare. Yeah. So that's why we told them, no, don't get rid of the private healthcare, no matter how much it's going to cost. And there's like a bunch of um, uh, how do you call those, amparos? I'm not sure what you call them in English. It's sort of like uh, it's not a lawsuit, but it's sort of like a stall for this measure in court. So basically, a lot of
Yeah,
people
like
are,
a blockade or
yeah,
impedance.
yeah, exactly. And a lot of people are doing that, and apparently with success. So basically, one judge ruled that they couldn't increase it by that much for retirees. So she's sort of appending on those kind of petitions to but yeah, that is really a first-hand case for me, where I see, like, these people are going to, it's like so brutal, because they also don't have any more time. It's all, for us, it's fine because we're young and we know that, like, in the end, this is going to make Argentina better. But most retirees, they don't have 10 more years or 15 more years to wait for that, and they need to pay the bills now, and they don't have the money. So it's yeah, it's really tough.
Yeah, you need that liquidity runway to make it through to that end event,
Yeah.
like Transocean. Argentina is basically the Transocean stock. Everyone knows the potential. We've just got to get from here to there
Yes.
without another
Oh man,
bankruptcy.
liquidity is really one of the things that I've been. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we can talk a little bit about it with the whole Bitcoin stuff if we're going to get into that. But liquidity, I think, is one of the most important factors, ever. And I've only become more and more aware of that. And that's why also I've been sort of steering away more and more from real estate, just because it's not liquid. And in this kind of environment, you really need liquidity, to be able to just sleep at night, and you're relaxed, and okay, whenever I need money, I can pull it from here and here and here. I can sell some stocks, I can sell some bonds, I can sell Bitcoin or whatever, something that's super liquid. So I have, the cash that I need tomorrow to pay for XYZ.
Absolutely. It reminds me of two things. End of 2021, I believe it might have been, when you told me your number one pick for asset classes was simply US dollars, and looking at what
Mm-hmm.
we were expecting with the rising interest rates. And our Uncle Rick Rule, saying that cash allows you to have the courage and the conviction to take advantage of market down drawdowns,
Yeah.
let's call it. And it's so true. You go through all these periods where you're like, goodness, I've got this cash. It's annoying me holding it there, but at the end of the day, it's that medium of transaction. Another medium of transaction that you've been using for liquidity is this thing called Bitcoin, which I still don't understand. You've been trying to educate me on this for at least 2 years, and I've been a very poor student. When am I going to listen to you, Mara? You've absolutely nailed the timing on this thing. You started to move what, close to 50% of your net liquid value into Bitcoin right around the recent bottom, and this thing has
Yeah.
hit all-time highs. What the hell's happening with Bitcoin, and how are you handling it?
So yeah, in terms of convincing people, I'm sort of not really in that role anymore, because I think everybody has to sort of figure it out for themselves. I can recommend like a couple of books to read more about it, and of course, if you're interested, then there's definitely a lot of very interesting resources around it. For me, the most interesting part is basically that if you have custody over your own coins, that nobody can stop a transaction. You can just cross borders with your own coins. It doesn't matter. You don't need banks. You don't need permission. It's just freedom money in that sense. And of course, it's volatile. So I do understand that, for example, in Argentina, people prefer stable coins on a crypto network versus Bitcoin. Which is totally understandable in the short term, because they basically think, I don't want my savings crashing, 10, 20% overnight, which can happen always with Bitcoin. And I just want something that I know, which is, US dollars. But yeah, no, I've had a conviction in Bitcoin just because it's the most decentralized network of all the crypto networks, and the safest play in that sense. I do make some smaller bets in the crypto sphere, but the biggest one is just Bitcoin, and I just ride with that. And basically, I now use that for liquidity as well, because yeah, I've put a big chunk of my net worth in Bitcoin right around the bottom. I always kept buying anyways, so it's not like a DCA into Bitcoin, what they say, like the dollar cost average. So whatever whenever there's earnings coming in or whatever, it's just like a part of that is going to go to Bitcoin, no matter
How
what the
much,
price
if you don't
is.
mind me asking, how much as a
Yeah.
percentage do you normally, I guess, auto transact and change, let's call it exchange from fiat into Bitcoin?
So yeah, it's a little bit different because in the last year and a half, I've been super aggressive. I've been almost transitioning every single fiat into Bitcoin, just because I knew that the ETF was going to be approved, and it was just like, this is going to be a moment that few people are going to understand, like how fucking bullish this is for Bitcoin. It's like all these billions waiting to enter, and it's just gonna go to the fucking moon. And that's basically what's happening, because even I think it dipped today maybe 10% or not even that, and it's getting bought up like instantly. I mean, there's so much liquidity there. And Yeah, so that was one of the reasons why I really wanted to buy a new apartment. But at the same time, I was sort of like, yeah, I don't want to spend the money. I don't want to sell Bitcoin for that, because I just feel we're just in the early innings of this whole bull market, and I think it's probably going to go up a little bit more. I do sell some along the way, but mainly for other investments, like this one I just entered. So what I did in this case was to not sell my Bitcoin, was just to take out a loan against Bitcoin in fiat. So and that can go from 50 to 70% loan to value, and you basically you deposit the Bitcoin. They give you fiat right away. You get stable coins or a bank transfer, whatever you want, without any due diligence checks. It's really efficient. It's awesome. You don't need any bank approval or whatever. It's like really in the minute, and that money is directly usable. So what I did was transfer that to a Cueva. They gave me nice stacks of Benjamin bills, and I paid the upfront deposit for my new apartment. Then I'm going to have to pay off in the next 18 months. But at least I don't have to sell my Bitcoin for it.
Okay, so let's slow this down for someone like me that hasn't really done this sort of thing before. So you take your Bitcoin, you put it in effectively an escrow account, I imagine, and
Yes.
they lend 50 to 70% of that value to you. In this
Mm-hmm.
case, sounds like pesos if you then went to the Cueva and exchanged them.
No, because I basically sent the stable coins so they could give me cash dollars.
Okay, all right. So they
Yeah.
lent you stable coins.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you cash them in at the Cueva. You
Mm-hmm.
use that for your deposit on this new property, and then
Yeah.
you are going to pay that off in installments. Tell me about this new property, as much as you do or do not want to tell, and how you're financing the final installments of this payment.
Yeah. So the property is a 4-bedroom apartment. It's in a new kind of area that is really coming up, Chacarita, a very nice area. And basically, what the terms are is that it's 14%, 40% upfront, and then afterwards it's 18 installments with I think it's 4 installments that have like what they call refuerzo, which is you pay a little bit more in those installments, and then the rest are all like fixed amounts. In the end, it comes up to the same price, but the difference that because this is like a peso construction, what happens is, and here, I already felt Millet in terms of the monetary policy, because it cost me some extra dollars, because basically they pacify the contract as soon as you pay the 40%. So basically, let's say the property is 300K, they pacify that as soon as you pay the 40% in dollars. The rest is then converted into pesos, and from that moment on, the pesos are tied to the CAC rate, which is the Cámara de Construcción, so the construction chamber rate of inflation, and that basically gets applied every single month. So with that, your peso installments increase every single month, and if the peso strengthens, the property is going to become a lot more expensive in dollar terms. So that's the only downside, like you used to have with the Pyrenees, that the pacifying was always a good thing. I
It's
think
a
it might
no-brainer.
not be a good thing. It might not be such a good thing unless there's a big devaluation somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah, but would the rates, the CAC rates, allow for that
Mhm.
though? If the peso is strengthening, then your percentage over above par would decrease, would it not?
Well,
In theory.
in an ideal world, yes, but at the same time, we're still in a very inflationary environment, so everything gets more expensive, and basically they base it on the a few variables. So it's the construction materials, the construction labor, and I think it's something like the logistics, etc. So basically, all those components, they increase every single month still, because there's still a lot of inflation. So it will make it more expensive, even if the peso strengthens against the dollar.
Yeah,
Um,
that makes sense because the input costs to that index are rising every month.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's fair, because also for them in pesos and in dollars, it's going to be more expensive. So I'd rather them do that than not finish the building, because
Indeed,
for them it's yeah,
they have to
yeah,
do it.
yeah,
So let's talk about real estate update. Have you seen an increase in volume of transaction? That was always the thing with Buenos Aires in particular, that it's a lot of potential there, but very illiquid markets. Have
yeah.
prices moved a lot over the last quarter, let's say? What have you noticed?
So listing prices, from what I've seen, have not moved that much, but they have increased a little bit. But especially what we've seen is an increase in transactions, basically. So a lot more movement on the market in the last 3 months, and I think that's going to continue, because technically everybody always says yes, but people earn so little now, and it's a historic bottom in terms of salaries, so nobody can afford these apartments, etc. But it doesn't really matter, because there's still people that can afford it, and now there's also a big chunk of foreigners that suddenly want to buy an apartment in Buenos Aires. So the demand is definitely growing, and I don't think that's going to slow down anytime soon, because if you look internationally, Buenos Aires is still relatively cheap. It's one of the more expensive markets if you look at the rest of Latin America. But the rest of Latin America is not Buenos Aires in terms of the old city, architecture, etc.
Infrastructure.
So yeah,
Absolutely.
infrastructure. So yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, that's on the demand side. One thing that struck me last I was there was the supply, that there was a lot of vacant supply just being held vacant because of
hmm
the issues around peso denominated rental contracts, which were like 3-year periods, and you couldn't, the landlord took all the risk. I believe that has been repealed. Have you noticed an increase in available rental stock that might be able to provide at least somewhat relief for local renters?
yeah, that's actually one of the few markets that have gone down, and the supply has increased. So after Milei repealed that rental law, that basically forced owners into renting it out in pesos and only being able to increase their rent once a year. after he repealed that, like, supply increased, at least doubled, and I think it's right now it's even more. So there's a lot of supply coming online because people, with these conditions, they want to rent it out. And the funny thing is, like, everything is priced in dollars. So, a lot of long-term apartments, non-furnished, for $300, $400. Yeah, there's a lot of supply right now.
Very, very interesting. So the free market, we're hoping will eventually do its thing. $300 to $400 US a month. That still seems reasonably cheap. Has the digital nomad bro been has his dream been banished thanks to Millet, that all of a sudden he can't come and take advantage of all the cheap prices? Or is it still a reasonable place to go for an extended holiday, let's call it? What does an average gringo need to budget in USD per month at the moment, to your estimation?
Well, yeah, it really depends on where he stays and where he decides to go out, etc. Like, if you stick to Palermo and really do kind of the gringo circuit, then you will definitely need a lot more dollars than you would have needed last year. Like, there with a studio apartment, and going out for dinner every single day, I think you would at least need 2,000 a month. A studio is still reasonably cheap, furnished. I think you could get one for, a month for around 600 to 850, depending on the place. So it's not crazy, but the cost of living has really increased. So especially restaurants in more touristy areas are a lot more expensive. It's still not crazy. I mean, you would, unless you go to Don Julio, which is like $100 for a steak. But in other places, it's still like the 15 to 20. But if you go more outside of Palermo, it's probably even cheaper. I mean, the other day we went with 5 people to a Parisha, and we had beer, we had drinks, etc. A lot of meat, and I think we paid like $50 or something for 5 people. So
Yeah,
yeah,
hardly the end of the world.
exactly.
Okay, before we move on to your services, a final word on Bitcoin slash crypto. How
Hmm.
high do you think this thing can go in this next bull run? Do you expect another major drawdown? Like, it seems to me that Bitcoin really follows the Nasdaq. There's a lot of correlation there, and I guess that's a reflection of liquidity or interest rate expectations. How high do you think Bitcoin can go before we have a pullback, if we have a pullback?
Yeah, I do think right now it's gonna depend more and more on what the Fed does, given the ETFs, etc. I still think there's going to be more inflows into the ETFs. Once that dries up a little bit, then I could see, depending on Fed monetary policy, that it would drop at a certain point. But I do think, like, the way things are now, we're in an election year. I don't think the Fed is going to operate at all. So basically, everybody's counting on that. So given that narrative, I would say the sky's the limit. Basically, what I think is, with the ETFs, it's really such a bull run, and being the Bitcoin maxi that I am, I'm also not blind to market sentiments. So what I'm also kind of betting on is that an Ethereum ETF will be approved around May, which I think is very likely, and basically front running that a little bit, because I do think that once that hits the cards, everybody's going to look at, hey, look at Ethereum, it's so cheap, and it's only like $4,000. Because people don't care about fundamentals or coin metrics or whatever. They don't give a shit. They just look at the price. So I could totally see that happening. And my idea is, then if that happens, then I would, and the price pumps, I would convert a decent chunk of that to Bitcoin again.
Yeah.
But I only do that with the speculative part of my stash. But I do see that happening. And once we see complete mayhem, like in 2021, because mainstream attention is not there yet, even though we've hit all-time highs, etc. I don't really see front pages about the Bitcoin mania, etc. It's still kind of like quiet right now. So until that happens, I think there's still room to run. And unless we get a super black swan with the whole situation in Russia going out of hand with Macron sending in French troops or whatever, you never know what's going to happen. So in terms of black swans, that is really something that could happen, but I just don't have any idea, or I can't make a prediction on it. But one of the things that I am going to do, even starting now, because I already paid the 40%, and that's a loan. I don't want to loan the rest of the apartment, so I don't want to keep funding these centralized platforms with my Bitcoin to get more loans, because of course the rates are pretty high. So if you do a 70% loan to value, the rate is about 19% year over year. So it's pretty high. You need to be pretty sure that Bitcoin is going to pump. Of course, I did it when Bitcoin was like 46K, so I'm good.
What happens if you
And
get margin called? Let's say,
Well,
I don't
margin
know.
call would be around 35,000. If
Okay.
Bitcoin drops to 35,000, then I would need to fund additional Bitcoin or sell the Bitcoin for that to cash in the loan.
Okay.
Um, and the other platform that is lower, that is 50% loan to value, there the rates are a little bit lower. It's I think it's 7.9% year over year, so it's still high in dollar terms. Um, so I don't want to use that margin too much, because it's basically going margin on Bitcoin. So the rest of the installments, I just plan on paying by my income plus maybe a little bit of Bitcoin.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Interesting. Was during the time where you were taking a decent chunk of your income and converting it to Bitcoin, was Mrs. Mara aware that this was happening?
Yeah, she was. And the funny thing is, like, I always ask her, do you think like these apartments just drop out of the sky? Because I mean, of course, it's not just Bitcoin, of course, because I do make a very, decent income. But at the same time, without Bitcoin, all this stuff, a lot of this stuff wouldn't be possible. So, and she said, like, well, until I see the key and I can open the door for me, it's not really real. It's not really there. So basically, she's giving me free reign to do.
Okay, there we
Yeah,
go. Okay,
yeah. So that's good.
here we go. Moving on to a very a very current topic. A very current topic you and I were talking about before we started recording. Your services include helping people, mainly young gentlemen, establish residencies, foreign banking, digital marketing, all that sort of wonderful good stuff. But you're an OG of the dating game down in, well, not now, you're out of the game, of course, with Mrs. Mara. But you were an OG of dating that particular specimen that is the South American female. We have a friend of ours on Twitter who we let's just say we're a little worried about his well-being. He's looking for a young lady. He's decided that he's going to go searching for that in Colombia. He's dead set on
Hmm.
it. He wants to be married with two kids before the age of 30, I believe. I read in his tweet. I wish him all the best. You and I have, I haven't walked the path as far as you have to marriage and children, but let's finish with a few comments on what to expect if you, how would you advise this young gentleman who has in fact booked a consultation call with you? What are we going to tell him, Mara?
Um, so I think one of the most important things to not get rugged in Latin America is, or rug pulled, is to basically at least learn some Spanish, because I've seen this firsthand with some of my friends from Holland. Some older friends, boomers, who did not speak Spanish, and it was just yeah, not the best combination, so to say, because you could just tell by knowing Spanish that some of these chicks were just out for their money. So I think, yeah, at least getting some sense of the language, the culture, that would really help to not fall into that kind of trap. Because for some people, you're just a purse running around, and yeah, the other thing is, like, I think he was looking for a virgin. I don't think that's going to happen past 15 in Latin America, to be honest. It's going to have a very hard time with that. I don't think he is aware of the party culture that is prevalent here. They might not admit it to their families, but it's just wild, so I don't think that's going to happen, and that shouldn't be the expectation of anybody coming to Latin America, to be honest.
Yeah, I want gold to hit 10,000 K an ounce, but so far that hasn't happened either. Okay, so we got to learn some Spanish. We've got to set some realistic expectations. Differences between countries. Each specimen is a particular flower from each country. I think a lot of gringos look at Latinas and just think they're all the same. Um, any words from the Mara as to regional or geographic distinctions between these exotic flowers?
Well, yeah, I think there are some geographic distinctions. I have met like or seen a certain tendency amongst like the more Andina countries, so more like Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela. Venezuela a little bit less, but of the celos thing, being like very jealous, and that kind of thing. But to be honest, it happens a lot here too, especially with porteñas. So girls from Buenos Aires can be like pretty neurotic about who you're talking to, wanting to see your phone, that kind of stuff. As soon as that happens, you can say, okay, it was nice knowing you, bye bye, because you don't want that shit in your life. So I've had a couple of those experiences, and it's a no brainer. Once you get into that kind of discussion, it's like, okay, have fun, bye bye, because there are a lot of normal people as well, and you just don't want to get up with that shit, or get to a point where you just say fuck it, and I'm not gonna, and then have that sort of friction, and that be okay. I know some couples that have that, and they get along while that's still a thing. But that is something definitely to keep in mind anywhere in Latin America and Brazil as well. Jealousy is a big thing, and once it becomes like really a problem. And the funny thing is, like, they can be super jealous, and at the same time they can be, rubbing up with some other guy, and
100%
that's not
projection.
and that's not a problem. What the fuck?
So we've just hit on something here. The neuroticism is real. The
Yeah.
volatility. So if you're coming from an Anglo-Saxon culture where um like mood swings, aggressive conversations, defensiveness is kind of, we don't do that. We try and keep our cool. You're going to be in for a volatile ride. The psyops that the Mara has just mentioned, for goodness sake, gentlemen, and I mean this with the greatest of respect, do not get caught up in trying to understand the logic, because you will go insane. The logic that the Mara just mentioned, that there's one rule for me and there's one rule for you, uh, that's definitely seems to be more prevalent. Let's say, at least.
Yeah, I would say it's and of course not everybody's like that.
No, of
I've
course.
I've been in relationships where that's definitely not the case. But you do need to be prepared that, if you see that kind of behavior, it's sort of like, that should be a no, because it's not. The first few years that I was here, I thought that was the norm and that everybody was like that, because that's usually the first girls that you run into.
Yeah.
but you should really know that that's not the case. There's the exact same kind of women in terms of neutrality and normalcy that you would find, in Australia, the Netherlands, or in the US, but with a Latin swing to them, which makes them more attractive,
Very
more interesting, or
spicy.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. But with the same kind of moral standards, that they wouldn't, screw you over, so to say, or they wouldn't be like super invasive of your privacy, because they're just super paranoid about things they would do themselves, basically.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Now, my question is, where the hell do you find those ones? Because I've never met them.
I think going out is really a tough place to find those girls, to be honest, because in nightclubs and bars, etc., you just particularly find usually the crazy ones. At least that's my experience. It also depends on the sector, of course. I mean, if you go to something like really a dancey kind of place or whatever. You just don't, well, you can't really talk. It's really hard to get a connection or whatever. When I moved here, I went to a couple of those underground tango bars. That's, you have chairs and stuff, and you can sit around and talk before you dance a little bit. And then you can have like a little bit more of a connection. But then at the same time, it's
Less of a
still
club
tough.
environment, more of a
Yes,
more
yeah.
chill. Yeah.
Yeah, but then at the same time, you still run across, a million of like crazy people. Um, so yeah, it's funny. Like my wife and I, we just met through a colleague of hers who was also a Dutch guy, and he was just like, "Hey, you should meet this dude," and I know, and he's a friend of mine, and we sort of hooked up and just went for a coffee. At that time, you didn't have Tinder and all that stuff, so maybe. I've never used Tinder, so I don't really know. Maybe nowadays that works with Tinder as well, because basically we met each other online first. We met through Facebook, started chatting, etc. So I think it's probably similar. And I think through talking to somebody even online, you can get a pretty good sense of if they're normal, or if they're kind of manipulative, or the way people write also for me always gives away a lot of the the kind of background, in terms of spelling, education, that kind of thing. The way they phrase their sentences, etc., is for me is a pretty big indicator. But I'm really always focused on linguistic stuff, so maybe that's just my thing. But it does work and help, you know, because I have
I think
noticed
it's
that when I sort of set that aside and try to not focus on, well, it's not that big of a deal, whatever. Usually they ended up to be, not the ones I was looking for. So
the red flag. What? It always you see it and we always ignore it. Why? Why do
yeah,
we do it?
exactly. Yeah, no, because the attraction, physical attraction is also very real. So,
Yes, it is.
and it is really hard sometimes because, I've been in relationships for, 3, 4 months, and I already deep down I knew that it was not going to work, but it was just like the physical attraction was just too big.
No, that's a real thing. And in certain
Yeah,
places, you need to be careful because it may be your physical, it will certainly be your emotional and mental safety at risk, but your physical safety as well. So don't be silly. No seas pelotudo.
yeah.
Learn some
No, I
Spanish.
think I think that I think that though, that like the physical safety is really a Colombia thing. Like the scalopamine stories, I've never seen them really anywhere. Maybe once or twice here in Argentina, but it's very, very rare to ever see that, like where they drug someone to steal his stuff. I really seen dozens of stories like that in Medellin, but in Argentina I've seen maybe throughout all these years only two. Of course, if this is one of the things, if things really start to get worse and worse and worse, I have no doubt in my mind that these things will start to pick up. Like in the 90s, for example, when at the end of the 90s the crisis was already picking up. There were a lot of what they call secuestros relámpagos, which is this basically kidnapping someone for a few hours to get money, that kind of stuff. So I could totally see, if the salaries do not pick up and people have a harder and harder time to get by, to see those things picking up again. No doubt in my mind. So that is kind of like a somber note, but it is reality, I think.
Yeah, and I think that gets overlooked in our excitement when we see the passport bros and travelers on Twitter. And I've been guilty of this as well, a little bit of sharing, you're having a wonderful time, wonderful experience, but just remember, things can go wrong and they can go wrong very quickly. Um, so
Yeah,
listen to the Mara. Make sure
yeah.
we do our due diligence. How long should this gentleman do his due diligence? Let's say he does find a genuine, lovely Latin lady. How long should he
Hmm.
do his due diligence before he takes things to the next level, be that a proposal or move in together? What would your thoughts be around that?
I think it's so tough because especially if you fly in and you have no experience of the culture. Even for me living in Argentina, to go to Colombia, say I was going to decide that now, okay, I'm going to live in Colombia. And to meet somebody and then decide, like, take that much of a step, I would have to know way more about the culture and family ties and how all that works. And luckily I speak fluent Spanish, so it might be a little bit easier for me. But Colombia is definitely not Argentina in terms of culture, so I'm sure there's like a bunch of things that I can't sense right away. And that is something that you really have to have your spidey senses on in Latin America, which is what a lot of our people from our kind of cultures, Calvinist, Protestant, don't really have any experience with. Is everything is super subtle. So you might be in a room full of people where everybody sort of looks at each other without saying a word. So it's like, see what that guy just did there, and you wouldn't know a thing. And it's sort of like, fuck, what did I miss? And then like afterwards, your girlfriend will tell you, everybody was fucking looking at you because you did this, and you were just like completely oblivious to that fact. And I mean, that kind of stuff happens all the time until live here for a while, and then you sort of ingrain that into your own, the way you act, and you sort of feel and sense that those kind of things. But they're very subtle, and if you just land here, you won't really notice that.
Yeah, I think another thing, I guess, I perceive that a lot of guys think it's going to be a lot easier and they're going to take the Latin lady back with them. Gentlemen, this, with the greatest of respect, this is not Southeast Asia. Here in Australia, we have a lot of older gentlemen who look for their second loves in Southeast Asia, and those women are very happy. They're keen to leave their home countries and to come to Australia. And that is not the case necessarily, particularly with Colombianas. They like where they live. They like where they are, and so you need to just maybe be a little bit careful about your expectations. You meet a lady and you think you're going to take her back to the US or Australia or wherever the case may be. Not necessarily. And this speaks to your point around really understanding the culture, and that culture can change significantly, even just across a land border. Uh, yeah,
Yeah,
good
yeah. No,
advice.
that's definitely a thing. And I think that's the most important thing you should be aware of. Also, yeah, also another thing that, for example, my first wife, she was from Brazil, and we met in Holland, and we lived in Holland for a while, but she was basically miserable there, and that's what I've seen, because we were hooking up with a lot of Latinos in Holland, basically because of the human factor. It's easier to make friends, etc., versus more cold Dutch people. But at the same time, I sort of noticed that all these expat Latina girls in Holland were all pretty miserable. Like if they really, they were there because of convenience, but in the end, they weren't really happy as they would be in Brazil or in other parts of Latin America. And I think that happens a lot when when they leave, even when they leave without a foreign partner, and they just move out of the country. There's always some part that doesn't really get fulfilled, and I think that's like the human part of social connections, etc. That is really strong here, and you just have less in more developed societies in terms of cash flow, and that's it's really
Yeah.
tough. That's why the ideal scenario for me is to just make money on wine and dollars and live in Latin America.
Yeah. It is a great lifestyle. It is a great arbitrage for the right person. And so
Yeah, of
make sure
course.
that, yeah. Anything else to add before we wrap up, sir? If you are not already subscribed to the Mara's Substack, you absolutely need to do it. It's a no-brainer. It's free and it's amazing content. I will give you the floor for your final words, sir, and then we shall look to wrap it up.
Yeah, no, for me, I think we touched on most things. Yeah, so if you want to get in touch, you can go to bowtypemara.com for private consultation. And if you want to read more about Argentina, then you can go to bowtypemara.io, where I share my thoughts about the current political and economic landscape, and also write about Argentina history.
Fascinating content, I guarantee. Links will be in the description. Guys, make sure you sub and like to the YouTube. Really helps with the algorithms. Be sure to follow the Mara and I on Twitter. It has been a pleasure, and I look forward to catching you in another episode of the Maverick Life podcast. Take care, guys.